We should be live.
Cool.
All right. Smash that subscribe button, you guys.
Right. Yeah, I believe we have 0 subscriptions.
I can forget all.
Probably safer
Good.
for the rest of the world.
We should be live.
Oop, that was me again. Good. Oops. Bummer. I hate it when that happens. I can stop sharing. This thing, when it tells you to share your screen, man, it is, it thinks different than you think. You know, you think you share your screen and then you think you change your screen and you're still sharing the same thing, but no, you're sharing the old thing forever. Doesn't matter what you do. So stop share and start share again. This time, here we are.
There we are.
You guys see something like an open topic screen in front of you?
Yep.
Super. Good. Well, the floor is open. The topic is open. Yet to be written in red or cast in bronze or anything else.
I think one interesting thing that we could talk at least briefly about, depending on how much you've come across it before, Uncle Tom, is I've talked to quite a few people recently that are really still excited about the Steele dossier, Carter Page, all of that. And then I just watched Jim Jordan's opening statement at the William Barr hearings, and that it's basically the same thing that he is kind of harping on at the start of his speech. Mm-hmm. And mostly I was just wondering, because that just doesn't pop into my news feed or the relevant type of news I look at too often. I was wondering if you would come across those ideas before, or how you approach them, because I'm not exactly sure what to do about it at this point. But
yeah, good question. JP, you follow this at all?
Not very much. I mean, yeah, like John talked to a few folks, and I mean, I know it came up a ton during the impeachment hearings in the House, which I listened to just about all of, and that's pretty much all that who was the guy from California who was Nunez, right? It's pretty much all he wanted to talk about during the impeachment inquiry. So that's I'm relatively familiar with it, but in that context, it just seemed like obfuscation to me, and so I didn't take it very seriously.
I think there's actually something really serious there at its heart. Like, there was actual mistakes made. I'm just not sure exactly what all the claims are for how far down the road that leads, or I mean, like the Carter Page FISA warrants, which they got them using the Steele dossier, which was total bullshit basically, and they shouldn't have been able to do that. So I think there are some actually really concerning things at its heart. I'm just not sure exactly where people take that line of thinking and how far up people claim it goes. So, but I think there's legitimately something there for sure.
Right. Well, one thing that's interesting is, and this is sort of a random place to start, but one thing that's not there in the news, in the objections that I listen to in mainstream media and a little bit broader than that. And that would include, yeah. But I wouldn't be surprised if Tucker Carlson doesn't fit into this following, but I don't listen to a lot of Tucker Carlson actually. But I think he does have an occasional independent streak where he will say things that lots of other folks won't say. But one of the things I don't hear people talking about very much is the very fact that we have FISA courts, or the very fact that we have an NSA. When's the last time you heard anybody complaining about the NSA or that whole story?
I mean, when Assange comes up, I feel like people bring that up, but
you mean when Assange sympathizers bring it up? I think that's right.
Yeah.
But I don't think you hear any Assange sympathizers on any of the main channel news network. Neither network nor cable news, any of those channels. I don't think you hear any pro Assange. You don't hear a whisper. You don't hear a complaint. Or anybody who has a complaint, they are not in the window of the legitimate. And I agree with those folks, and that's why I try to characterize my. I also read outside that window, as you know, because I've been sending you one of my favorites, who's really quite an Assange defender. Right? Yeah, so it's interesting that inside we call this FISA abuse rather than it's about an abuse of the system rather than the system is an abuse, is the story. And I just found that to be an interesting way to frame the narrative. They didn't do it quite right. They took liberties. Whoever the they is, whatever the liberties are. I don't mean to minimize it by saying not quite right. There might be people who think it was a terrible violation, right, of legitimate FISA, call it jurisprudence or whatever you call that avenue of decision making. People may think it's terribly egregious, but they don't seem to talk about the FISA process as terribly egregious. Which I'd say puts it in
that's mostly just the secret court order stuff.
Yeah. So I'd say, I'm looking where the fire is coming from. Where's the smoke? Where's the fire? And I mean, not just, I need to stretch my metaphors a little further. Not just where those who are yelling fire say the fire is coming from or where the smoke is, but where are those who are yelling fire also in the process? And when they all sit inside, insofar as they tend to sit inside a structure that takes the FISA courts as unchallenged and instead challenges the procedures inside the FISA courts, put it this way, I'll ask it as a question. Is that true? Are the folks who are making noise sitting inside that structure, taking it as sort of above the conversation as settled that we have such a structure and that it's ever used without abuse? Or that the very structure itself isn't abusive? Right? Or those are sorts of language you might have. And those, if you thought either of those things, that might really change your focus on Carter Page, right? And on the particular use. It might change the narrative a little bit. So I guess this is more an ask than a statement. And I don't mean to ask you as if I expect you to know it. I mean, you may have something to say about it, in which case that'd be great. But we could ask that. I think that's an important question. Where is the noise coming from? And what are the things that people are not talking about when they make that noise? And I think that's useful for figuring out what to think about the noise that they do make.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure exactly, but my impression is that the story is about that particular abuse of the FISA court, not housing that in a greater problem with the courts in general, but just looking at this one specific case that affected them so much. So, I mean, which I think is fine. I mean, if you were, I think it's worth everyone taking a look at, it seems, to talk about the problems that that type of court brings up. But how is it? It seems like it could mostly be a secondary topic.
Which could mostly be a secondary topic.
Addressing the issues with FISA courts.
Right. Right. That's a way of looking at it.
Shut
Let
the
me
door,
give
please.
you, let me stretch that same your house is on fire metaphor, or maybe that takes the metaphor of smoke and fire further. I didn't necessarily mean your house is on fire, but although you could ask whether it is, but suppose you thought that suppose you thought you were in a room which was intentionally darkened by smoke all the time. And in that, you were asked to look really clearly and in a lot of detail at something which you wonder whether it's the very producers of the smoke that are asking you to take this careful look. That if you thought that was going on, you'd have a different attitude toward the thing they want you to look at. You might think that the smoke exists to keep you from looking at anything other than what they ask you to look at. And if you get a chance at looking at something in a room which is designed for you not to see anything, or to see very little, or to see only what you're supposed to see, right? If you thought you lived in that kind of room, you'd be really skeptical when somebody says, look over here, a bright, shiny object you can see really clearly.
Who is the they? Who is the people doing the obscuring in this analogy?
Well, that's a good question. So now I'm trying to take the analogy out into the real world and say, are there clear analogs? And that's fair. Of course, if it were a good analog of our current situation, I suppose the answer is I wouldn't know very well, because I'm in that room too, and I'm in a smoke-filled room and in an intentionally smoke-filled room. So on that analogy, it would be difficult to see. I realize we're on the edge of letting in every conceivable conspiracy theory, almost by design and definition or something, right? And setting up the problem this way. I get that. And I don't mean to do that. I don't mean to let in every single conspiracy theory, but I do think that we've got a lot of evidence that we live in a surveillance state, that we have an enormous amount of money going into surveilling. And if you're gathering information, you might wonder whether what you're doing with that information, and are you ever manipulating anything, or are you just a passive recipient of information? Right? In fact, we live under this. One of the things we're allowed to see, if you push this narrative forward very far, one of the things that you hear people talk about all the time is the whole Russiagate story on this side or on that side. But the very thing which is being claimed there is that a foreign power is gathering information using its information gathering capabilities and controlling the narrative with it. And maybe you only think that's something that foreign powers do, right? Which of course would be pretty naive to suppose only foreign powers do that.
Yeah,
Then
but I think we know we do it all the time, but it's just particularly upsetting when foreign powers do it.
But maybe only to other people. Maybe we don't do it to ourselves, right? Maybe we only blow smoke. We're only in the smoke and fog production business for other people's houses, and the smoke and fog in our own house didn't get there by our folks. Must have come a different way, right? That's why it's hard to tell, right? That's why you have all these competing narratives that, or put it this way, let me back off. The competing narratives that we have, they couldn't have been put here on purpose. They must have been put here on accident. Or don't ask how they get put here. They weren't put here at all. Or that's not part of the subject. Because the smoke in our house, the thing that makes us hard for us to see, is not the interference, except insofar as it is from these foreign people way out there, right? But our own capacity to generate that kind of confusion could never be turned on our own people. Nobody would ever do that. I mean, I'm being facetious here, right? You make the same argument about surveillance, right? The surveillance capacity is for all those other people. Oops. Except for what? Except for Snowden.
Right.
Yeah. Snowden relations, et cetera. And not only Snowden, but he brought a new level, right? An unparalleled and unimagined level, which is almost all entirely forgotten. When's the last time you've heard Snowden's name in public space?
Oh my God. I mean, we're certain the government does it for national security, but it seems like, would that be making the claim they're using that same apparatus for like national politics or something, or just to figure out what people are thinking? Or
well, isn't that actually the accusation that's being made on stage here? Isn't the nature of the accusation that you mentioned, right? That, hey, there was a Steele dossier. It was paid for by political interests. It was trumped up, no pun intended, right? Set of charges. And it was used to generate surveillance on a US citizen. And all of that was for political purposes, says one side about the other side. Right? So maybe it ought not to be too far-fetched for that side, right? To imagine that it might be used, that we might live in an intentionally smoke-filled room. Because that smoke, right, that obfuscation, that information control and manipulation, that gathering of information to trump up, again, excuse the pun, right, to fabricate a whole set of charges which would completely occupy our time and attention. All that, according to the accusation, was done on false pretenses. Is that a fair description of the charge?
Or
have I run too far afield there?
I think generally. But what is
that?
What is the difference between the people creating? I guess I just don't understand how drastic this smoke is, or how controlling, or because all of that stuff that you just described, that fits perfectly into the realm of what pretty much everyone thinks about politics and the media in general. I don't think very few people are under any illusion that politicians and the media don't all try and create stories for their own benefit. Hopefully not out of absolutely nothing, but I mean, I think everyone thinks that to some extent.
I suppose.
So what's the difference between that and the type of worldview that or world that you're setting up?
Yeah, fair question. So you could imagine smoke in the house because of a lot of little fires that just happen to be there. And you could imagine a general lack of carefulness, right, amongst people.
I mean, or intentionally set, but yeah.
Who are lighting them. But if they set them intentionally, you have to ask why. The answer is profit. So they're in effect public arsonists, right? And they're just commercial. They're just they're mercenary. They're mercenary arsonists in the information space.
I think everyone knows that like opposition research and negative campaign ads are a thing, and they're typically, everyone thinks they're like typically a bit trumped up. I don't think people might not love them, but I don't think people have a massive issue with them in general, which I think is that they would be an example of intentionally setting fires or something like that.
Right. So I suppose it's not the case, actually, since I've, in general, the movement, my thought in answer to your question, what do I think about it, is to take some bright and shiny object that everybody sees and that people are spending a lot of time on. And I want to know who's spending that time on that. What else are they not spending time on? In particular, the very people who fund this whole apparatus time after time. And I don't suppose that politicians are drivers here. If you want my opinion, I think that politicians are generally not drivers, which is not to say they don't have much influence. I think a number of them have some influence, but I also think that they're not the source of funds, and they're not the source of conditions on funds. I don't think they're the source of either of those things. And I think those are things which actually, those are things that you pay mercenaries with. So the same question would go to, the same level of analysis might go, or a parallel level might go toward people in media who are working for big corporations. They have professional careers. They're idealistic oftentimes, so they're not motivated necessarily by money. They didn't go into journalism for money, maybe. They sure do. The ones you see all the time and hear all the time make a lot of it. They've actually quite well succeeded. So that whole environment is also not where I find the driving is happening. I would not look there for driving. I would look there for, they seem to me more the means, information, narrative control means rather than narrative control drivers. So who would really be driving? Who's capable of driving? People who've got a lot of power and influence are capable of doing that. And what would they be after? Or what are people with a lot of power and influence generally after? It may very well be more power and influence and maintaining the status quo where the world works the way they want it to work. And I don't think those people generally are in the public view, not as politicians and not on the evening news. That doesn't mean that you might not know some of those people. People have a lot of money and influence. I think you do. Sometimes they get found out. Sometimes they get complained about, right, by somebody else. Somebody complains about the Koch brothers or about George Soros or et cetera, right? So it's not, and I don't deny that those folks have a lot of money and exercise a lot of influence. But I would be very surprised if all the people who had money and influence were right out there to try to put their hands up and say, look at me, look what I'm trying to do for me. Right? A lot of money, a lot of money and a lot of influence is sort of like the ring of Gyges. You remember that ring in Republic Book 2? The having heard Socrates' defense of justice against Thrasymachus, right, who was praising injustice, the advantage of the stronger, right? The young men say, do you want to persuade us really, or just seem to have persuaded us? And if you really want to persuade us, well, you're not quite there. You're not yet doing what you want. What would you say if somebody were to put the argument like this? Here's this ring and it turns you invisible. You put it on, it turns you invisible, right? And what would you do with that ring? Well, any damn thing you wanted. And if you didn't, you'd be a fool. And everybody would say that if you behaved justly when you had that ring. Everyone would say you're a fool if you were just, but they would not say that publicly, lest people publicly distrust them, right, and circle up against them. But that's what they would all know, and what they would all do is exactly whatever the hell they wanted, right, with that ring. They would behave with injustice. And I'm wondering whether money, large amounts of money, is kind of like that ring. Because you can hire people to cover your tracks. You can hire people to do things 3 or 4 or 5 steps removed from you. You can hire people to think through, right, the chances of your being detected, et cetera. And where does all that money reside? Well, it seems to me our federal government has control over a great deal of money. Our security apparatus has an enormous amount of control over money that we don't even know what they have. We're not allowed to know. And our military apparatus has control over a great deal of money as well, some of which we're not allowed to know. And all of that is shrouded under state secrecy, is shrouded under national security. And you're just not an American if you distrust anything, right, when it comes to national security. That's a universal defense to throw up what? Smoke. And we have professionals who do that. And those professionals may or may not be the ones who are driving. But that's where I would tend to put it this way. Given all of that, I would be skeptical of the bright, shiny object that keeps coming to people's attention. And I'll take one tiny step further since we're this close. If you had a ton of money, would you want to have to spend a ton of money in order to radically change things the way you wanted? Or would you rather keep a state of affairs where you hardly have to spend any money in order to get what you wanted? In order to do that, you might try and have a two-party system where the parties are simple, opposed to one another, and in relative equilibrium. And just like a titration, you drop in a couple of drops, right, phenolphthalein or whatever the indicator is at just the right point, and boom, you change the color of the whole environment with just the tiniest little amount when you're at that equivalent, when you're near that equivalence point, right? And I think when there's that kind of power equivalency in the perceived power structures, then just a little bit of money either spent on perception or threatened to be spent on perception becomes very, very powerful. And what do you know? We just happen to be in such a situation. What a coincidence. A happy accident for really, really wealthy, powerful people who are apparently stupid as fuck. Pardon my YouTube insult, right? They're probably incredibly stupid because, at least on this model, they're behaving like blunderers with their ring rather than like stealthy craftsmen, rather than hiring people to think through what the state of affairs ought to be if they're going to get the most from their power, their influence. They just happen to inherit this beautiful situation, right? If they happen to inherit it, they're stupid. If any of them, that is, are self-interested, if any of them are like the young men in Plato's Republic said, everybody says everybody is, right? And Socrates spends the whole time to say, no, you don't have to be like that, though it's difficult not to be. So
Yeah.
given that whole world, I'm done talking about it, but that's a different setting. That's the setting within which I hear those stories about the bright and shiny object of the FISA warrant problem from the very people who have funded, right, the FISA courts in the first place and don't say much about it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely more that we to go back to on that setup there. But in this scenario, what makes it, or wouldn't everything basically be a bright and shiny object then?
Everything you see clearly and brightly in the public view. I'm not saying no accidents happen. I'm not saying that people who try to exercise control exercise it perfectly. That's probably not right. And I think it's difficult to figure out. But when you hear a drum beat and you hear lots of people from lots of points of view keep honing in on the same topics, that's probably not an accident after a while. That's probably on purpose. It might have started as an accident, but it's probably not an accident anymore. It's probably an opportunity somebody seized. If they didn't seize it, what are they doing with their power and influence? Maybe they're not buying anybody with any sense.
Well, it does seem like there's currently competing interests in the smoke-filled room, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's not a unified front of these people who seeking power and influence, and it seems
Sure.
like based on what we've heard about the Carter Page incident, that somebody, and it looks like the Clintons, were using the FISA court and using the intelligence community to gain an upper hand on Trump for political influence. And so that's one side of what's going on in the smoke-filled room. It's people on that side of the aisle. And then on the other side, now there's people trying to point that out. And now they're shining light on that particular thing. But it sounds like you're saying that the same people who are now shining a light super brightly on this particular politically motivated use of the intelligence services are the same people who have funded and facilitated this sort of oversight in the name of national security in the first place. Is that what you're saying, Uncle Tom? You're saying a lot, but is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah.
And so you're skeptical of their particular focus on this issue.
Yeah. Let me ask you how interesting is a puppet show or a movie or anything on the wall of Plato's cave, to use that analogy, right? To put us back into the Republic for a minute and look at what Plato's central image for what it takes to turn the soul, right? To turn the soul and see what's really going on in the world as a whole. You've got to first see that the very first things that are put in front of you are manipulated by others, right? That's at least an element of the, and whether Plato meant it that way is a great question. In any case, we can borrow that analogy a little bit, right? The shadows on the wall. Are those shadows on the wall especially interesting when they are There's no life there. There's no drama there. Do we watch shows about knitting, or do we watch shows about homicide? Right? There's drama when there's conflict.
Yeah.
So if you want to hold people's attention and get them to pay attention to things you want them to pay attention to, and not pay attention to the things you don't want them to pay attention to, if you wanted to do that, you would have protagonists and antagonists.
Mm-hmm.
So people who pay a lot of attention to these facets of the world sometimes use the phrase, we have a one-party, two-headed system.
Hmm.
And what they mean when they say that, when they use that phrase, is yes, you've got two heads, but they're two heads of a puppet in like a little Punch and Judy show, right? Where you've seen the slapstick of puppets hitting each other, right? All controlled by one. And here I'm slightly, they might be anyway, right? But what you see is this conflict. And you could even have, that conflict could be literally a tighter metaphor is one puppet, two heads, right? Just barking at each other about all the things that you get to bark about. And it's very important that there be things to bark about. And so we might imagine that a lot of things are there to be barked about, and they're not unimportant things. If they were completely unimportant, nobody would pay any attention to it. So you've got to be able to bark at those important things that you're allowed to bark at, and not notice the important things that you're not supposed to notice and never bark at. That's what you might do if you wanted to hold a huge populace's attention.
Mm-hmm.
That could very easily, if they chose to, change the political structure. They could change the economic structure. They could change the tax structure. They could vote. They could change it. Just like that. And you wouldn't want that. So if you wanted to survive on top of an environment in which they could, you might want to distract them so that they don't vote and radically change the power structure.
If there was someone who had this clear a view of the American political system, it seems like they would also have a good idea of what the better systems are. If they're able to see the problem so clearly, they should also be able to say who does it better. Is that part of that world as well, that there are other countries who have a system that actually doesn't lend itself to this type of?
Let's see. I understand the question. It's a fair question, but I think it's a question that has some built-in premises. Those premises are something like, as a whole, the world does not work in the way I just described. As a whole, in any case, it's really possible to put together some large geopolitical structures large enough to be noticed, large enough to be a competitor for the way things are put together here, right? Which don't work and which haven't had the same sort of forces operating there that are operating here. And you'd be looking for that clear, non-smoke filled room somewhere, right? Because the fire hasn't spread everywhere. You have to admit, if the fire is, and its roots, if the love of money and control and power and influence and the use of other people to achieve more of that for yourself, if that were out of control, right? Or put it this way, insofar as it operates, you might think it operates anywhere money operates in the world.
It would, and yeah, I certainly would not think that there's a lot of countries that operate in an obviously better manner, but
They'd have to be small, right? They'd have to be small. They'd have to be pretty unified. They'd have to have some kind of common political structure. They'd have to have enough in common that being torn apart for the control of other people is visible and plainly bad for them, and they would resist it.
but it does seem that we just went through how we almost have a system so uniquely susceptible to this type of power politics. It seems like there are a lot of different systems in the world. It seems like you might be able to pick out one that does it a little bit better or is less susceptible to this.
Who's the we and what's the system? So I didn't draw borders around US politics necessarily. Why would you, if you behave this way, why would you stop behaving that way when you got to Canada or Mexico? Just
Well,
right? Why would
the two had it.
That trade policy, for example, ought to be treated the same way because a lot depends on it. And now it's not just Canada or Mexico because we live in a global economy. So where wouldn't you be paying attention to how things operate and trying to control how things operate in this sort of way? Where wouldn't you find undue concentrations of money, power, influence, etc.? Right? Where wouldn't you expect to find those things involved in narrative manipulation?
So you would always certainly expect to see it to some extent or a large extent, you could say, but it seems that the puppet dog with two heads,
that's very good. No, that's entirely fair. So that was a deliberate reference to US two-party systems. And there are other countries that don't have two-party systems. They have multiple party systems.
Right.
Although whether, I remember in the martial arts context one time learning about multiple attackers. And there's a limited number of multiple attackers that you have to worry about at any one time because they can't all get to you at once, right? There's only so many places you have to look. So you might imagine something is similar in a political fight too. As long as you control the major partners, and unless the fabric of your political structure is so splintered that there simply aren't any major partners. There aren't any major clusters of power such that when you grab two of them and set them at odds with one another, you're now grabbed a great deal. You may have to pay some attention to a third in the wings. And of course, we have parties in the wings in the United States too. Right? But they're never, we nonetheless live in an explicitly two-party system. I wonder if I were trying to do this, I might try and keep an explicitly two-party system. I might try to have a de facto two-party system, but I may have to vary who the partners are from time to time, right? As those other parts, that's quite possible. And that might be harder to do, and I might be less effective at it in that space. And so maybe those are situations where it's less easy to control the narrative in those places. Doesn't follow that I wouldn't still be trying or that I might not use the same means. So I'm letting myself off the hook here. And that's probably not fair, right? I think we ought to come back and you ought to hook me again. But all that I think is relative. I think all that fairly conditions the response though. Right. So I probably wouldn't say, let's just go to England, right? Without looking at to what extent English politics is intertwined. And it's been intertwined for a really long time to some extent. These days, it's intertwined in a very substantial way. And you look at the nationalist movements in all sorts of countries and and the exchange of ideas and personalities across those movements, and probably, although you don't get to see this as plainly, to see the exchange of money across those territories as well. Without knowing all that, you couldn't really fairly look at another environment and know what's going on there. So it's, once again, I find myself making excuses for the fact that I don't have a Shangri-La to point to. Right? Of course, if what I were saying were right, you wouldn't expect there to be a Shangri-La that lasts very long, because that Shangri-La would be a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you don't want a threat that doesn't come under your sphere of influence, your sway. And if I use the next word, I would be biting into a political narrative, your empire. Right? You might remember in Thucydides the speech of Diodotus against Cleon, and they're arguing whether they should crush the Mytileans on this little island of Mytilene, which is, and they revolted. And the question is, how do you deal with those people? Do you go over and crush them, or do you go over and you treat them, bring them back with gentle correction, something like that? And the phrase, and maybe I'm wrong about where this debate sits, or this phrase sits, but my recollection is it's maybe even Cleon in that debate who says, you got to realize that your empire is a tyranny. It might have been wrong to take it, but it is certainly dangerous to let it go. That about the Athenian Empire, right? And people who pay attention to this sort of narrative control, corporate power and influence over narrative control, over military policy, over, and we could go on and on, but we can dive into more specifics if you want to from this point of view. But the people who have that point of view oftentimes use the language of empire, but they don't think we're the first empire. They just think that there's always been empires. And we just are in the middle of one now. And that empire extends to all the places that you'd want to go. The other places are just shithole countries. I mean, to use the thing that somebody might say of them. Unless they have natural resources, in which case they're not.
So is the point of this system, you would say, at least like at its highest level, is just acquiring wealth and perhaps even like maintaining wealth inequality, like because they always just need to be at the top, they have to keep others down? Or
let's see, if you wanted to hang on, first, if you wanted to grasp as much as you could, right, you generally are in conflict with other people who have very much, and you'd take from them. You wouldn't care very much if that eroded the very fabric of society. And this is Plato's account of how an oligarchy undermines I'm forgetting the name of it, his phrase, but people who are run by honor-loving people, a society that's run by honor-loving people, a democracy. That, at least in the English translations, use that way. And there are people who are in fact lovers of money and not lovers of honor, and they grab as much of it as they can, and they corrupt the citizenry in order to pull money from them with no thought about the well-being of the whole society. And as a result, they for a while gain an upper hand, and you have an oligarchy. Eventually, that oligarchy, because those folks love money, and it's a good question how it falls. Because they love money rather than wisdom, they do not really know how to rule themselves, and eventually they lose control to the many. And that's what democracy is. Democracy happens when the many poor people say, see those fat rich people? Those men are ours. We are more of them than they are of us, right? And we can take those people out. And that's what happens. Democracy is what happens when the poor win. All is what happens when you don't have the rule of wisdom shot through the very fabric of political life. So I'm suggesting that insight, that set of insights 2,500 years ago, captures something pretty fundamental. And so what is people who want a lot of money and power, what is it that those people want? They might just want more money and power. That might turn them on one another under some circumstances, or if they have some control over themselves, they might partner up with other people, at least for a while. But what they wouldn't want is for things to get out of hand. And if everybody had a lot of money, they might have the leisure to figure out what's going on and participate in various ways, and maybe even back their own causes. So it might be better if the poor didn't have very much money to back their causes. So you'd probably try and lay out tax policy so that it's in people's advantage it's in people's economic advantages to continue favoring regressive tax policy. So after all, if they don't do that, they'll lose their 501, their 401ks.
Is maybe it's too simple of a question, but would less wealth inequality then be an example of a system that is influenced less by the system we've been talking about?
I think that's a fair place to go sniffing around for more popular control, is in a place where people have more money, have less wealth inequality is more wealth equality, if I got my double negatives straight, right? So yeah, if wealth is shared more equally, I think people can participate in political life more equally. And I think they may have, you might be able to find people who gather and can actually afford to get their own, to have people think together, to have people get their own information, develop their own policies, et cetera, as opposed to just those who are paid. I mean, the extreme would be all the think tanks around the dole. I'm not saying that's true in our society, and that would be a great blanket statement. But I do think that, sure, when people get a good education, the worst thing that happens is you have a very good popular education. That's the worst thing to happen, because now you got very bright, creative, productive people. It's hard to control those people. Maybe it's just an accident that we live in a society where our education system is falling apart.
It does seem like I don't know exactly what the overlap would be, but there seems to be a bit of overlap between this view of the world and I don't even know what the word would be.
Conspiracy theory?
No, like Marxist view of the global capitalist system.
That's right.
And its effects on the world, and
or a Christian community like Acts chapter 2, right, where people sold what they have and they just gave to one another, whatever they needed, they just helped one another out. And they did so freely, right? Unless that was the spirit, it was free. You might remember in Acts, somebody did it and only wanted to seem to do it, but they held some back and said, well, we sold everything we had and we put it in, but they didn't, right? And they were they were kicked out. As a matter of fact, they died suddenly.
Yeah, I think kicked out's putting it mildly.
Yes. It was anticipated that they would die, and they did. Narrative purpose of the text. Yeah. So anyway, I don't mean, I just went on, and but I dumped a lot of crap at you. But all I guess I mean to say for now, let's back way off and say what you think about a story like that depends a lot on how you see the whole set of structures at work in the world.
Mm.
So a question for me is, it seems like you could almost have that same exact conversation about almost any topic we've had on a given Wednesday. Is there something about this in particular that lends itself more to this conversation?
No, we've just been waiting to bring the hammer down in a certain way. I mean, right. The reason for bringing it down in this particular situation is this particular conversation is all about narrative control, right? It's an objection that there's just been, it's a loud, sustained, bright, shiny objection that there is narrative control. And it's these other bad guys who are doing it, not us who are doing it all the freaking time, not us who are doing it equally, say,
Yeah.
right? Or us who barely get to play. It's none of those pictures. It's those other bad guys, right? And you get to say that over and over and over again. And it'll be on the evening news for a long time. And it sort of smacks of Russiagate. It's just the inverse. It's one over Russiagate. But when you multiply them together, you still get the same number. To really warp my inverse analogy, or not warp it, but overextend it.
Mm.
So, I mean, I guess one, I don't know, counterpoint or point could be, I mean,
Good.
That seems to be the truth with pretty much every story that happens these days. That it's like you pick a topic and it's going to be, these guys are trying to push a narrative and it's totally false. This is the actual truth. I mean, that just seems to be a reality of how we talk these days about almost anything.
Yeah, it sure does. So let me ask you to perform a little exercise if you're interested. Let me ask you to put on a hat, imaginatively. Put on a high information flow network of rich community aspirant hat. That is to say, put on the hat that what we really want is a network of rich communities that interact with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And that interact with one another in ways which respects the cultural traditions and importance that operates inside communities, but also respects it operating in other communities and sees it all as an information gathering, assessing, and informed decision-making model, but a model in which all these things need one another. All these communities need one another, and provides an opportunity for information to flow. In that environment, what's the question I want to ask? What does the news look like?
A bunch of fractured pieces of worldviews.
It sure could. If you just sort of flew into somebody else's community, you might hear a very different narrative in that community, and what passed for news there might be quite suspect to you. They're asking all the wrong questions, you might think.
But I mean, I guess just a bunch of different networks that are unconnected. I don't know.
So that sounds like a mere heap of rich communities, not a high information flow network of rich communities.
Hmm.
And it points to a challenge that would be present in that community. There would be different stories, different narratives, different spins on what's happening in the world. Perhaps at least different topics, and maybe really different opinions on the very same topics.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you do if you wanted to put forward the news in a way which wasn't warring against another tradition, but respected its existence? In fact, knows that you need it, like another player in the league, like another team in the league, like another complementary competitor in a business environment. I'm thinking of a city the size of South Bend, Indiana, where various players might be competing with one another, but they know that they have some common interests. I'm thinking, for example, of OrthoWorks, the medical device industry advisory board, or there's advisory boards to it. And they gather together, all these folks, many of whom are actually competing with one another, but they have some shared interests. And so they pull together and have an advisory board, and those competitors are competitors, but value one another's existence at the same time, because together they're a lot stronger than they would be if they were separate. So what if communities had that attitude toward one another? How would they view one another's news? How would they share news?
I mean, I think if that was actually the case, then there would probably be, I mean, either you could attempt to have both sides on every issue or attempt to get as close to the truth as possible. That seems like the two main options.
Are you empowered in that environment to adequately tell the story from everyone else's point of view?
Whose perspective am I taking right now?
Sit yourself in one community, take your pick, and imagine there were a dozen communities, and they were radically different from one another, at least in some respects. They were significantly different enough from one another that they continued, they may interact with one another on some common projects. They might be civil toward one another. They might know they need one another, but they're really different from one another. You think of, I don't know, think of the Jewish community and the Amish community in this part of our world, just to take two subcultures that might be very different from one another. I don't mean to say there's one of either of those, by the way. That's a really misstatement. But you can imagine folks who are Amish and folks who are more traditionally Jewish, and I don't mean traditionally in a technical sense because I don't know enough about it to use it in a technical sense, but I just mean folks who identified in a very different view of the world. They did not live with Amish. They didn't know the Amish that well, though they might know them well enough to interact with them, say, commercially and economically, and they might value them. They might think they're an important part of the economy. If we're small enough and the stakes are low enough, you can imagine people getting along across community divides in this sort of way. So how would they tell the story from their point of view when there are these other people they need to get along with who have a very different point of view?
I mean, try and tell your story from their perspective, I guess, or
one could.
their story from your perspective, but
You might think they're qualified to tell their story from their perspective, and you're less so. But you might try at the same time to take into account that they have a perspective. You might, for example, try to bring their report. What if you each had your own newspaper? And what if the reporters cooperated with one another? So that there's sort of a maximally informed Amish community take on this set of economic developments that could really shape their community. You could imagine somebody from a different point of view. I don't want to focus on any two communities right now, but communities are hard to come by, right? I mean, you have to sort of get weird and on the edge of offensive and probably mostly irrelevant to talk about communities of substance. That would be true in any case if McIntyre's thesis is pretty right. At least my interpretation of McIntyre's thesis is pretty right, that what we've lost are whole communities that can think through the world together and that really parallel process in rich networks of trust, right? If we're not exactly up to that job now. We're not doing that. Where do we do it? Not at universities. Where does it happen? Well, to some small extent, it happens in small, out of the way places, maybe. Therefore, it's hard to describe. It's hard to set up without offense or irrelevance or being Pollyannish or science fiction-y or something, right, about what these communities might look like. But I think if you start small but not too small, the size of a big city, which starts to have enough there that you could actually have robust clusters of people with different points of view, now you might start to see elements congeal in a network where there is some degree of information exchange that is not shots fired, so to speak, in speech. So how would those people get along? I think they might have their own take on the world, and they might make it pretty clear that this is their take on the world. They might have an Amish newspaper, a Jewish newspaper, this trades, a union newspaper, and I think you just have to go back in time to probably find more of these things, because I don't think you generally see those newspapers anymore. They've all been bought out.
mm-hmm.
So if you had them, though, just the fact that it is the Amish newspaper, and if the Amish community were at all transparent to the rest of the community about what they were up to, then the fact that you read it in the Amish paper sort of tells you something about the take that their news came from, and you might want to look at it from their point of view and read it from their point of view and see it from their point of view, see yourself from their point of view, and look at their news. Is it fake news? Actually, I don't think you would denigrate it in that way. It's Amish news. It's news from their point of view. If people didn't know one another's points of view, you might even have a primer. How to get to know, how to read an Amish newspaper. How to read here's who we are, about us, right, on their website, with some real substance there, so that you understand when you read this news, these are the kinds of issues that are of great concern to this community. And it's why they look at it through these lenses. And it's that they look at it through these lenses. And now you have not only data, but you have metadata. That metadata gives the provenance of the stories. It says, here's, if you know that word, it's used in art and it's also used in computer science sometimes, the provenance. Where has this data been? Who's done what to it? Right? So you might imagine that whether it's formal in a metadata sort of environment, a pairing, and you can imagine that, you can imagine the AP moniker means something. Go look up what the AP means, right? What an AP wire story means. It means we stand for these things. Here are our principles. Here are the things we're wrapped around, we hold in common. We pursue these kind of stories from this point of view. that might be a kind of truth in advertising. It doesn't claim neutrality, and it isn't fake, and it isn't one size fits all, and it isn't anything like what we have now. But why couldn't it be? And why wouldn't it be beyond fake news? I think it's a way forward.
Yeah.
But it's a way forward that only happens if people organize their social lives in a certain way and their intellectual lives in a certain way. Otherwise, if we're all at the center of our own trust network, we got our own news, so to speak. You might have little trust networks around little things. Like, here's where I get my national policy news from. I get my presidential politics news from here. I don't get my economic news from them, maybe, or maybe you do, insofar as it's interwoven with policy. I don't get my scientific news from them, maybe, except insofar as all these things have to do with one another at various times, in which case you might imagine that you would start to get even your scientific news, even your COVID news, right, to take a hot topic, or your global warming news, right, or your those sorts of news. You might have to, now it might get complicated. So you might have my point there is you might have, who knows what that little ring of trust that you might build, right? But it's a good question as to how far that goes. If all that stuff is really just about presidential politics, or it's really just about national politics, and everything else gets in, not because you give a rat's ass about global warming or about health policy, it only gets in because it affects, insofar as it affects the things that your little trust network cares about. And now I'm starting to describe what we actually do have.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget how we got onto this question. I asked for this little excursion into a high information flow network of rich community paradigm excursion into what news might look like. It's pluralistic. It's not antagonistic. There's nothing fake about it. It's all essential, right? Or reasonably essential. People bring in what they can bring in. But you would expect if you had a large community, if you, for example, were the mayor of a large city, you would be reading all of those major newspapers that were put out by major organizations in your city if they had newspapers. That, of course, is not the way news works, but it is the way that news used to work. I don't mean in some Shangri-La sort of way, not at all. I just mean that we had, that we were more connected, in part by accident of geography and how much money your family had when they came over from a different land, right? You tended to be poor, you huddled together, you clustered, you shared resources, etc. Have you guys ever seen Avalon, the movie?
Mm-hmm. Good movie.
It is. And it's a story of the transition of a community, right? That comes over and that hangs together in a very tight communal way, and how that community eventually gets eroded over 2 generations in that story, if I remember. Or maybe only 1 generation. Maybe it's the lifetime of 1 man, right? It was, they were just boys at the beginning.
Right.
Young guys.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I don't know. I wonder about the whole pluralism without antagonism idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could be pluralistic as long as people were being honest and actually putting a fair effort into incorporating all the information they could into their worldview. But once people start being just willfully not incorporating new information into what they think and only presenting certain parts of it, I don't think pluralism is appropriate. I think those people are acting in bad faith in the community.
Mhm.
And so it seems to me the really important thing is the incorporation of as much information as possible into the story. But I just and your conclusions based on your information could be different, and based on how they fit into your narrative of the way the world works. But I don't know. I think that the pluralism without antagonism idea is hard for me to see happening in real life.
Okay. Because of practical difficulties or because of theoretical repulsiveness? And not that those are the only options, but if consider those two for a moment.
What was the first one again?
Practical difficulties. Can't get there from here.
Yeah, I
Versus
think
don't want to go there.
let's see. I would say practical difficulties. I think yeah. Maybe that's just me being pessimistic right now, but I just don't see people being willing to do something like that. I think antagonism's too fun and too natural.
Cool.
And
Well, that's a very interesting insight.
yeah,
Too fun or too cool to what? Too fun or too cool to run into it, or too fun or too cool to ever avoid letting it master you? Not that those, again, are the only options. Those are maybe extremes on a spectrum somewhere.
right. I think it's too cool and I think it's too attractive for there not to be some substantial segment of a population that isn't mastered by it.
Yeah. What segment of the population and what segment of a population in a well-ordered, well-structured community with a good education system?
Well, I just think there's always
Where would you look for susceptibility and mastery?
Let's see. I think it would probably manifest itself. I guess I think there's just what are the words I'm looking for? I just think in any particular group, there's always going to be people who are more competitive, more driven, more there's a word I'm looking for. Conscientious isn't the word, but maybe it is. Maybe it is the word I'm looking for. But have a particular competition needs, and then a particularly strong attachment to things being a particular way. I think some people are more open to new ideas and experience, and some people are less. Openness to experience is a particular dimension that people fall upon, and then also how competitive they are. I think.
You suggested there may be different natures involved here.
Yeah.
Right. Some people some of that could be by nature, although you didn't really rule out. Maybe it was my own importing of nature rather than nurture there. You might imagine
I think it's nature. I think nature more than
the tendency, or the do you think the nature is such that there are people who just can't ever put truth first because they were not born that way? I'm setting that up in a very particular, that's again, way on part of the spectrum. I'm just trying to ease into the possibility. Where do you think the possibility lies? that there's an educated dimension of this, educated in a very broad sense.
Yeah. I guess it depends on how, basically what you think. I guess it just depends on what you think truth is, and then how effective you are at actually convincing people of a particular truth. Like, truth is just a way of being in the world. Like, seeking the truth is just a way of being, like, or are there particular truths? And yeah, I'm not sure. I think that would be the challenge. I guess that would be the challenge in response to that is, how do you actually get everyone on board with what the truth is? I mean, I just think there's always going to be people who will resist that idea.
As to what truth is or which things are true? Did you mean more the latter than the
Both.
former? Both.
Both
Okay.
of those things.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe you could nail nurture well enough to mitigate those differences in people enough, but I think there's always going to be certain groups of people based on their personality, which is mostly genetically determined, it's my understanding, that are going to resist that sort of structure.
Would you say that's true for every tendency, or truth in particular? Is it true, say, with regard to mastering your fear? Is it impossible for certain kinds of people to develop courage?
I would say it's a lot harder.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
But there we're on a spectrum.
Right.
You might imagine, I mean, if you granted that with regard to putting truth before whatever it is, self-aggrandizement and argument, or whatever it is, that thing, right, that the person with the wrong bent is hell-bent on getting instead. Right? That might have too many words to make my point. I'm wondering whether conducting yourself in a way that pursues truth effectively, is it analogous to conducting yourself in a way that deals with fear effectively? Effectively according to whom? How about effectively according to you, on reflection, on informed reflection? Because we're talking about people who've sort of been educated. And that means in all the ways you need to be educated. That means they've learned something on the athletic field. For example, they know how to master that. They've learned courage on the athletic field. They may also have learned humility on the athletic field.
Sure. I just
learned a kind of realism on the athletic field.
I guess what I'm getting at is, I think that some people will be antagonistic for the sake of being antagonistic on whichever in whichever dimension you want. It could be truth, it could be courage. Like, no, I'm not going to be courageous. No, I'm not going to believe what you're telling me, regardless of what you're saying.
I don't want to wear a tie. I forget where that's from.
Right. Or maybe differently, I just don't actually want to figure. I just want the world to be a particular way.
Yep.
And I'm going to ignore whatever you tell me is different about it, because I want it to be a particular way. And I don't want to work to figure things out.
Yeah.
I just want to be
comfortable.
Sound
like a very young person to you? A person, they may have stayed young, but they could have come by that.
I think that could characterize a younger person, yeah. But I think there's lots of old people that are like that.
Is that because they never grow? Is that because they've never grown up? or because growing up is impossible for them? Because I mean,
Probably
that's a
because
really
they,
hard.
yeah, I mean, they never, I don't know. It depends on, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by grow up. I mean, maybe they like their life and,
That's right. They might.
you know, they can just,
Well, you're getting at very important points here on nature and nurture and education. That's for sure. And what can you expect out of this raw material? What kind of steel do we have here?
yeah,
Right? Can it take this much stress and strain, or will it crack?
yeah,
Or maybe all steel is not alike, right? Maybe.
I mean, I just think there's significant comfort in certainty, and pluralism is not. Antagonism is what gives you more certainty, I think, versus pluralism. And
it's good.
so there needs to be a way to resolve the. Anyway, maybe I'm just sort of harping on the difficulty of actually setting up this
This is good.
particular system, but
A further question would be, if you're right, can people generally tell the difference? And would you pick somebody like that to run your newspaper? To swing way back conversation.
yeah,
For a community to have it together, you might imagine not every single individual has to have it together. There may be kind of material imperfections, but as long as you have some plurality to choose from, you might not take that, we could go around and make fun of profession personality type matches, but you can imagine these are not really good matches.
yeah,
But that doesn't mean there aren't any good ones, and that the community as a whole couldn't be led in various areas by people who've got particular strengths, not particular weaknesses in those areas. What would constitute a strength or a weakness that's a good question. But certainly, I think we all know that there's a range of weaknesses that we ourselves might have that we could nonetheless recognize as weakness.
yeah,
Right? So it's possible in any case, at least on a subjective standard, somebody might say, yeah, I'm not the right guy for that job.
yeah.
And that person might be right, and everybody around him or her might agree with him. No, don't pick that guy for that job.
Yeah.
Well, this is a lot of cool issues, and we get into, when you deal with any issue and you hit it hard, you run into connections between lots of that and lots of other ones.
Certainly.
John Rose, how about to you? Last word. I don't mean to call it a last word. How about the beginning of last words, because we're in at 90 minutes.
I don't know. I guess I would say it might be possible to hit the start of the conversation a bit harder. I think we got a little bit sidetracked from that.
Yeah.
I certainly know I don't actually have a lot of knowledge about that topic. I don't actually really know where to go on that one, but we might have ended up going the best way. But I guess I would close with saying everybody should come over here tonight.
I love it. Just what I was fishing for.
Nice.
Yeah, nice. Good. Well, we could come back to it sometime if we want to.
Yeah.
But for now, let's put let's do it. Let's shift gears toward a little more fun. This was fun, actually. I think so because I talked too long. But, often happens. But thanks, guys. A lot to chew on here. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I've been thinking about this for a long time, I have to tell you, and I've got a lot more to say about it and some interesting things to drop on the table in this area of what would news look like in a community. It's a good question. What is fake news? And this idea of metadata and perspicacity, what's perspicacity? One of those words, right? Being real forthright, right? In identifying where you're coming from. Starts to emerge as a bigger deal if you pay a lot of more attention to where you're coming from. And if you start to describe it and you start to bring other people in, right? That there you start to have where you're coming from rise to the surface a little bit more. You have a more reflective community. And there it's not absolutely crazy to imagine putting out a position paper, for example, in which you're not speaking as a neutral person, you're speaking as one of these people. And these are the ways we're looking at the world. And this is why we think this is so important. And then you could imagine that kind of speech moving into even investigative journalism or just the general, just informing people in your community about what's going on. Filtering, for example, putting a news feed. You remember the days, do you remember Google Reader? And before Google Reader, something else like it. It was basically, this was way back, way too much to say here. Another time, let's talk about old versions to deal with technology, because there were solutions in the early days that are now gone that recognize certain problems with technology and that tried to implement solutions to it, and those disappeared. And we'll talk about Google Reader as an example of that sometime.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. We will, I hope to see you later this evening, actually. But if not, we'll catch up again. It won't be Friday, by the way. Don't we have a wedding on Friday? No, we've got family pre-wedding things on Friday.
Yeah.
That would be true for you, John, anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I travel on Monday, so.
Oh, you do? Wow.
Yeah. I'm out of here.
You're out of here. How did August get here that fast?
I know. It's crazy, man.
All right. Well, now I'm definitely coming over tonight.
Sweet.
All right.
Oh, good.
All right. See you soon.
Bye-bye.